It's nothing new that married couples get divorced, even though they once swore eternal love and fidelity to each other. And if there's still something to gain, such divorces often turn into a mudslinging battle, with both sides fighting each other with heavy legal artillery. But just like with people, such divorces also happen between states, especially when one of them commits a massive violation of international law. That happened in 2022. Since then, everyone has been declarations of love by Western politicians toward the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, have fallen silent, including those from the dozens of German politicians who were heavily involved at the time. And for those now pointing at the often boastful Donald Trump, has he really shown more sympathy to him than an up-and-coming, very left-wing German politician from Jena? And when it comes to American presidents in Russia, I would like to remind you of another United States president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, who maintained an almost mystical friendship with a man who is now known as a mass murderer, Joseph Stalin. In 1941, the United States and Great Britain formed a close alliance with him to defeat the strange coalition of Germany, Italy, and Japan that was waging war against them. But just 2 years earlier, with the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact of August 23, 1939, there had been a German-Soviet brotherhood in arms. On September 1st, the Wehrmacht invaded Poland from the west, and from the 17th, the Red Army entered from the east. Poland was then divided between Germany, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, Lithuania, and Slovakia. The conclusion of the joint campaign was a field parade in which German frontline troops and the commander of the 19th Army Corps in Army Group North, General of the Armored Troops Heinz Guderian, and the commander of the 25th Mechanized Corps, Major General Semyon Moiseyevich Krivoshein, took down the parade together, during which both were able to conduct an animated conversation in French. And in addition to the official meetings, there were of course also the usual obligatory propaganda photos at the level of the ordinary soldiers, when showing off different weapons or exchanging stories from their respective countries. But this brotherhood in arms changed abruptly on June 22nd, 1941 with the Operation Barbarossa, through the attack by the Wehrmacht and its allies, Italy, Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, and Finland. Now German and Soviet soldiers were bitter enemies, with the latter allied with the two, economically and later, also militarily strongest countries, the United States of America and the United Kingdom. As the war progressed, more and more countries joined the fight against the Axis powers shown in blue, Germany, Japan, and Italy. This made the world look like this from 1942 on. In September 1943, the Americans managed to bring Italy over to their side. Here, on the 8th, General Giuseppe Castellano signs the armistice negotiated on September 3rd between Italy and the Allies, in the small Sicilian town of Cassibile, near Syracuse. General Walter Bedell Smith, Chief of Staff to General Eisenhower, stands on the right. He congratulates Castellano because with his signature, he has achieved an important victory. Almost overnight, Italy, which had been allied with Germany, dropped out as a comrade in arms. Then, on October 13th, it even declared war on Germany. In the weeks that followed, it became painfully clear how quickly even years of comradeship in arms can turn into bloody enmity. Because when the Italian divisions were disarmed and partially interned by the Wehrmacht, there had been many very unpleasant incidents, resulting in several thousand deaths, particularly among the Italians. When in April 1945, the powerful World Alliance succeeded in pushing the German army into an ever smaller area, both from the west and south as well as from the east. On the 25th, American and Soviet troops joined forces at Torgau on the Elbe. As the encounters continued, there were fraternization celebrations and other shared activities. in which the scenes were sometimes very similar to those that had taken place during the German-Soviet meetings in 1939. But even these friendly images of GIs and their comrades in arms from the Red Army would soon belong to the past. After Germany had unconditionally surrendered a few days later, the victors sat together during the 3 Potsdam conferences from July 17th to August 2nd, 1945, and discussed Germany's future. But now, the Big Three were without Roosevelt, who had died on April 12th and was sympathetic to the Soviets. With the new United States President Harry S. Truman and the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who was already suspicious of Stalin, were now sitting 2 Western politicians at the negotiating table, who did not see the Soviet dictatorship as just another kind of democracy, like Roosevelt, and who also didn't want to be fooled by the so-called Uncle Joe, as Roosevelt had been. The closer the Allied victory in Europe came into sight, the more Churchill's fears were confirmed that Stalin would not stick to the agreements that were concluded from February 4th to 11th, 1945, in Yalta on the Crimean Peninsula. Among other things, it was decided there that after the war, Poland would form a communist coalition government following free elections, but that Polish dissidents who had fled to the West and were living in London should also be involved. In contrast, at the conference in Tehran, which took place from November 28th to December 1st, 1943, it became clear that the United States of America and Great Britain would agree to the westward shift of Poland as desired by Stalin, and that Poland would be assigned to the exclusively military operational area of the Soviet Union. And shortly before the Potsdam Conference began on July 17th, the Allies, the United States of America and Great Britain, who were still under Stalin's influence, withdrew on July 6, 1945, their recognition of the Polish government in exile and instead recognized the communist-dominated government as legitimate. Thus, the harsh German occupation during the war had now been replaced by a communist dictatorship secured by Soviet bayonets, which led the person that was not unresponsible for this, Winston Churchill, to write a letter to Foreign Minister Anthony Eden, who was heavily criticized for his unconditional approval of the forced repatriation of Soviet citizens after the war. Catastrophic things have happened because Russian dominance is making its way like a flood. Afterward, the territories under Russian control include the Baltic provinces, all of East Germany, Czechoslovakia, much of Austria, and all of Yugoslavia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. This is one of the most depressing events in the history of Europe, and one without parallel. We must now pin our hopes on an early and swift showdown, and an agreement with Russia. But what had already been happening in the political background for quite some time by then only became known in 1998, under the term Operation Unthinkable, because what sounds almost unimaginable today actually happened back then, immediately after the German surrender on May 8th. Churchill had ordered the Joint Planning Staff of the British Armed Forces to plan an attack on the Soviet armies stationed in Central and Eastern Europe under the title Operation Unthinkable. The main objective of the 2-phase operation was supposed to be to use strategic and technological superiority to drive the Red Army out of Germany, and then, from offensive positions in Germany, to force Stalin to agree to the future of Central Europe. On May 22, 1945, just 2 weeks after the unconditional surrender of the German Wehrmacht, Churchill's personal chief of staff, Lieutenant General Hastings Lionel Ismay, had completed the operations plan and handed it over to his boss. The hypothetical attack date was set for July 1st, 1945, but it could be postponed due to the ongoing fighting against Japan. The plan called for a surprise attack by 47 British and American divisions, as well as some Polish divisions, against the Soviet forces stationed in the Dresden area. However, since the Red Army had a manpower superiority of 4-1 and a tank superiority of 2-1 in that area, something had been planned within Operation Unthinkable, which, just a month earlier, would have been considered reason enough for being committed to a madhouse. The formation of 10 German divisions, released from Allied prisoner of war camps and newly rearmed, around 100,000 former Wehrmacht soldiers who would then fight side by side with their new American, British, and Polish comrades in arms, were supposed to liberate Germany and parts of Eastern Europe from the Soviet army. However, the architects of the operation plan were also aware that the Soviets would have to be driven out before the onset of winter, because otherwise a long and total war would threaten. But Operation Unthinkable was nothing more than a historical footnote. Because when British Lieutenant General Ismay presented his final assessment on May 22, 1945, he judged the operation plan as militarily unfeasible and also dangerous. He was right, since the Soviet Secret Service People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs had already learned very early about Churchill's and the General Staff's considerations through a spy. However, this hardly surprised them, because Moscow had always distrusted the Western Allies, and when it came to plans for conquest, they themselves were not exactly squeamish. As a reminder, this map shows the number of Allied armies stationed in Germany on May 10, 1945. Red represents the Red Army. In contrast, the United States of America reduced its army over the following months until 1946 by 3 million men, and the British reduced their 750,000 men to 100,000, which meant that in Europe, there were only 900,000 Western Allied soldiers left, facing 4.9 million battle-hardened, well-equipped, and always combat-ready Soviet soldiers. And in fact, Stalin had already considered, back in 1944, what to do after a victory over Nazi Germany. With his army, which was superior to the Western powers, he wanted simply march all the way to France and Italy, and at the same time conquer Norway and Denmark to secure the Baltic Sea. It can be assumed that such an advance against the exhausted Europe, minus Germany, would have been successful. If it weren't for the United States using atomic weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki, had proven to Stalin that they possessed such a weapon and were also willing to use it. And then in August 1945, there was also the statement from General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Plan Totality, created under President Harry S. Truman's orders. According to this, a nuclear attack was supposed to destroy these 21 Soviet cities, but Operation Totality was only intended to misinform and deter the Soviet leadership. Since in 1946, the United States only had 9 atomic bombs and just 27 B-29 bombers to carry them. After the atomic bombs dropped on August 6 and 9, 1945, Stalin's invasion plans were halted for now. However, that didn't stop his successors. As can be seen from Hungarian and Czech documents published in 1990 and Polish documents released in 2005, that at least since 1964, further scenarios were considered under the name 7 Days to the Rhine, the Warsaw Pact's vision of a 7-day nuclear war between its forces and NATO. Back to May 1945, to the Operation Unthinkable. After the plan had finally been shelved and those responsible hoped it would be forgotten, it was almost revealed by Churchill in 1954. In December, during an otherwise unimportant campaign speech in the Woodford constituency, he had rather casually mentioned that, in 1945, Field Marshal Bernhard Montgomery had been instructed in a telegram to store the weapons captured from the Wehrmacht in such a way that they could be handed over at any time to reactivate German units, who, in the event of a Soviet attack, would then fight alongside the British. Subsequently, the British press picked up on this topic and questioned whether that had been a direct order from Churchill and what had happened to the telegram. After the Soviet press had also denounced Churchill's so-called crusade, and critical articles had appeared in the British and American press, Major General Sir Edward Spears, who had been brought in to verbally support Churchill, said, "The whole thing is absurd. The Times is acting as if Sir Winston had asked Hitler for help against Russia, even though Hitler was already out of the picture." In the end, Churchill had to admit that there probably never was a telegram, and that the order to Montgomery had only been given verbally. But with the quick end of the hypothetical Operation Unthinkable in May 1945, the tensions between the Western powers and their former ally, the Soviet Union, were not off the table, particularly since Stalin continued his aggressive policy of conquest, which even convinced the peaceful and naive United States foreign policy makers to start outlining their own plans for post-war strategy. However, there were no orders from the highest authorities for this, unlike with Churchill and his Operation Unthinkable. Instead, there were only military strategic studies by individual officers, as well as the United Chiefs of Staff of the branches of the armed forces, that is, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who, for example, dealt with the military capabilities of the United States and their need for worldwide bases and military reserves. Interesting about this was their assumption that the new missile weapons, such as the V-2 rocket further developed by the United States, could not fly beyond 1,500 kilometers, and that atomic bombs would always be too large, for example, to be fired by artillery. From this, the experts concluded that nuclear weapons would always be just a supplement to conventional weapons and would not play any special role as a deterrent. But because the Americans had not consulted with their British colleagues during these months, from late autumn 1945 on, it had been an increasing cooperation between the two armies and an exchange of information about Soviet operations. Because of these now constantly incoming and verifiable British intelligence dossiers, which were also confirmed by their own agents, the United States Intelligence Service began to take the Soviet threat seriously. After they then estimated the current military capabilities of the Soviet Union in October and November 1945 at more than 60 infantry divisions, 25,000 tanks, and 60,000 large-caliber artillery guns, they had come to the conclusion that the Soviet forces could easily overrun Western Europe and the Middle East at any time. And after the Soviet Union supported a communist uprising in northern Iran in September 1945, which then led to the short-lived Autonomous Republic of Azerbaijan, the United States Joint Chiefs of Staff, on March 2, 1946, prepared a draft for Operation Pinchel, the American counterpart to the British Operation Unthinkable. In contrast, Poland was no longer at the center, since the Soviet Union had established a ring of satellite states to protect its borders. For this had Pincher, which feared a possible war between 1946 and 1949, its eye now on the Middle East as a hotspot, and also Turkey and Iran, where Soviet interventions could force the Western Allies to launch a military counterstrike, which could also end in a Third World War. But what the United States planners couldn't have known was that practically everything they had exchanged with the British had been reported to Moscow by the Soviet spy ring known as the Cambridge Five, including the nuclear development program classified as top secret. The Cambridge Five were Kim Philby, Donald MacLean, Guy Burgess, Anthony Blunt, and John Cairncross, all of whom worked for the British Intelligence Service, who had been recruited in the 1930s as students at Trinity College, the elite University of Cambridge, and had reached high positions. During World War II and into the early 1950s, the Cambridge Five supplied the Soviet Union with all kinds of information, both about the planned war strategy and the weapons technology of the Western Allies, whereas speculation about further members of the spy ring continuing to this day. Donald MacLean had also reported possible United States retaliation plans to Moscow in the event of an attack on Turkey. Therefore, it is conceivable that Stalin did not carry out a planned invasion of Turkey in 1946. But it was not only the United States government that had changed its policy towards Stalin. Meanwhile, the British Foreign Office had also adopted the concerns expressed by Churchill in the spring of 1945 about a Soviet dominance, where they now considered northern Italy at risk, along with the Mediterranean. And if unrest were to break out in Europe at some point, in their view, Stalin would have no scruples about ordering a communist uprising in France, which would then be followed by a communist coup attempt in Belgium and in Spain, a triggered civil war that would ultimately result in a communist regime ruling there. But the greatest fear for Great Britain remained that the Soviet Union could, from its zone, launch an attack and take over the German economic power, which was still down but would eventually recover. According to Napoleon's statement, whoever wants to rule Europe must have Germany. Because compared to the massively demobilized Americans and British, both the Soviet armed forces and industry were still in war mode. Joseph Stalin also gave a campaign speech on February 9, 1946, at the Moscow Bolshoi Theater, in which he reaffirmed the Marxist-Leninist view of the world for the first time in almost 5 years. During the Second World War, he had hidden most communist propaganda in patriotic rhetoric about Mother Russia, assuring his American and British allies that he was a loyal and selfless partner in their war against Hitler. But at the Bolshoi Theater, he stated, quote, that in reality, capitalism had caused the Second World War. Quote Stalin, the war has broken out. As an inevitable consequence of the development of the economic and political forces of the world on the basis of today's monopoly capitalism. And he had continued that, just like in the First World War, now also between 1939 and 1945, the competition for markets and access to raw materials had led capitalist countries to go to war with each other. In this, one of these warring capitalist camps, consisting of the Axis powers Germany, Japan, and Italy, quote, had been so cruel and despotic that the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics had entered into an anti-fascist coalition with the United States of America and Great Britain. But, according to Stalin, this meant that the threat of capitalism would remain, despite the victory over fascism. Then he let the cat out of the bag and stated that under the current capitalist conditions of global economic development, another world war was inevitable. The United States and Great Britain, because of their imperial ambitions, would eventually come into conflict, and after that, they would try to eliminate the Soviet Union. Shortly after Stalin's announcement of the Third World War, the United States diplomat George Kennan, who was serving as an envoy in Moscow, sent his famous long telegram of over 5,000 words to the Treasury Department in Washington on February 22, 1946. In which he stated that the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics saw itself in a constant state of war with the Western world. In the eyes of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, democratic socialists and social democrats were not allies, but enemies. The allies of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics in the Western world were Marxist groups under the control of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The policy of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was rooted in a historically based Russian xenophobia and paranoia. The communist form of government was structurally incapable of forming a realistic picture of internal and external conditions. Finally, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was characterized by internal instability and was fundamentally inferior to the West, both intellectually and economically. On July 5, 1945, Churchill, despite his great achievements, especially for Great Britain, lost the parliamentary election. As a result, he was replaced in the middle of the Potsdam Conference by his inexperienced socialist successor, Clement Attlee. Unlike Churchill, who had always maintained that Germany should not lose too many eastern territories, especially Silesia, and that he, Churchill, would not support resettling or expelling the 8 million people already there, repeatedly undermined both Churchill's and Truman's positions, thereby ensuring that Stalin was able to fully push through the westward shift of both the Soviet and Polish borders at Germany's expense. But then, the still prominent Churchill gave his legendary speech during a trip through the United States of America on March 5, 1946, in Fulton, Missouri, in which he, in the presence of President Truman, issued a serious warning to Russia and then spoke of an iron curtain that was now descending across Europe. He also reminded, using the example of National Socialist Germany, that the appeasement policy before the war had been counterproductive and that now, in the post-war world, it would also be seen by Stalin only as a sign of weakness. But even though Churchill had hit the nail on the head, the response to his speech, especially in Great Britain, was rather subdued. However, this was hardly surprising, since there was still a strong sense of gratitude on the island toward the Soviet Union and its undeniably heavy losses in the war. However, this public goodwill was also a result of the uncritical pro-Soviet propaganda by the British government during the war. Therefore, it was completely unrealistic to assume that the British public would cheer for an attack on the Soviet Union less than a year after the end of the war. However, more important by then was that Churchill's views were no longer seen by the United States of America as extreme or as an obstacle to better relations with Stalin. Just a few days before Churchill's speech, the United States intelligence chiefs had completed their war plans for Operation Pincher. According to their estimates, the Red Army had, in the spring, 1946 in Germany and Austria, 51 divisions, 50 divisions in the Near or Middle East, and 20 divisions in Hungary and Yugoslavia. These 121 divisions were supported by a central reserve of another 152 divisions in the Soviet Union and a total of 87 divisions of pro-Soviet forces in the satellite states of Eastern Europe. A Soviet attack would most likely overrun Western Europe and capture the Channel ports and the Netherlands in just over a month. At the same time, attacks would be launched on Italy and the Middle East. Given the overwhelming numerical, personnel, and material superiority, it had been recommended to move the United States troops to Spain or Italy in order to avoid possible annihilation by the Red Army in Central Europe. And if the Red Army were even to march all the way to Spain to block the Western Mediterranean, the United States units would be evacuated to Great Britain, which would mean sacrificing Germany, Austria, France, and the Netherlands. The retreating Allied forces would then be relocated to the Middle East to strengthen the defense around the vital Suez Canal zone. This means that the United States Chiefs of Staff have now also accepted that a key goal of Stalinist policy was, quote, to dominate the world. They had also announced that there would be a Western counterattack, but only after the Red Army had conquered Western Europe, the Balkans, Turkey, and Iran, and after South Korea and Manchuria had fallen in the Far East. And although Pincher did not go into further detail, it can be assumed today that the United States and its allies would have carried out massive airstrikes against the Soviet Union from their remaining bases in Great Britain, Egypt, and India, and that the United States would have used its growing stockpile of nuclear weapons, for which planned totality might even have been activated. And the United States Navy would have tried to isolate the Soviet Union with a blockade and destroy its fleet in the process, until an attack launched from the south across the Mediterranean would have been attempted to recapture Western Europe. With this, the political and military leaders of the United States were now discussing all the scenarios that Churchill had included in his plan for Operation Unthinkable 18 months earlier. Yes, almost overnight, the Soviet-American-British Brotherhood in arms, which had been so effective in the war against Germany, turned into a climate of mutual accusations and threats. The Cold War had begun, during which both sides armed themselves to the teeth. The general staffs kept developing new attack and defense plans, and each side established a military alliance. NATO was formed in the West on April 4, 1949. In the East, the Warsaw Pact on May 14, 1955. But that's a topic for another reflection.